Now it is my pleasure to introduce our speaker. I'd like to thank Stan Phelps for joining us today. Stan is a TEDx speaker, Forbes contributor, and IBM futurist. He's the founder of purplegoldfish.com, a think tank that inspires leaders to think differently about their most important stakeholders, their employees and customers. Before founding purplegoldfish.com, Stan held leadership positions at IMG, Adidas, the PGA of America, and Synergy. Stan is the author of 5 books, including the Amazon bestseller Purple Goldfish. He teaches in the Rutgers Mini MBA Customer-Centric Management program, always receiving stellar feedback from the participants. We're confident you will all enjoy learning from Stan too. And with that, Stan, please take it away.
Great. Thank you, Margaret. And I want to thank everyone for joining today. One of my latest books in the 10 different colors in the Goldfish series focuses on how do we handle pressure? How do we thrive in the game of business? Now, here's the thing. Can we talk right now about the microbe in the room? We're in the midst of a global pandemic, certainly over the last 2 weeks in terms of the George Floyd incident. We're dealing with another crisis. I think we can all say that we're handling a tremendous amount of pressure, maybe more than we've ever had in the past. And when we're under pressure, we tend to act in anything but a rational manner. I always like to share this photo right here. Why is it we would even go out and buy 238 rolls of toilet paper? It doesn't make any sense. We wouldn't do that if we were acting rationally. The Diamond Goldfish book is about this idea of how do we manage our relationships so we can truly rise above the pressure and thrive in business. And it's a book that focuses on both sales and business development, but also client management. So let me share 2 of the big challenges that the book addresses. One is from a retention perspective. So most businesses have what we call in marketing the leaky bucket, meaning that on average, you're losing 1 out of every 4 customers that you have on an annual basis. And to put that in perspective, even if you had a little bit better, an 80% client retention rate, that means you're turning over your customers every 3 years. So that's the retention challenge. How about on the sales part of the equation? Well, that same ratio pretty much applies because given business development opportunities that we have, on average, businesses close only 1 out of every 4 opportunities that are created. So if that's the challenge, that you're having a difficulty managing the relationship and retaining the customers that you have and the clients you have, and you're also not, you're failing at least 75, if not 80% of the time when you're trying to close new business. If that's the challenge, then what is the solution? And I believe in my co-authors from Market Force Global, Tony Cooper and Travis Carson, who we work together on the Diamond Goldfish. The solution is simply the idea of being able to see and to do things differently. I love this quote from Marcel Proust. He said, "The real voyage of discovery consists not in seeking new landscapes, but in having new eyes." So to be able to see things differently. And I want to share, this is a fun example. I was sharing with Margaret, I played tennis in college. So this is a fun one. Does anybody recognize who this is? Feel free to type it in the chat if you recognize who this 15-year-old is. So
We have
this
some people
is a
saying Boris
15-year-old
Becker.
named, what's that?
We have some people saying Boris Becker.
Boris Becker, yes. So he quit school. He's from Germany, quit school, West Germany at the time. He quit school in the 10th grade to pursue playing tennis professionally. Now, was that a good move by Boris? It was, because within 18 months, he walked into Wimbledon unseeded and became the youngest man to ever win a Grand Slam tennis title, defeating Kevin Curran in 4 sets and shocking the world. Now, just a year after he won this title in 1985, there was another 10th grader, and this 10th grader was from the US, and he also decided to quit school in the 10th grade. Now, he's right over here, the second from the left. That 10th grader, type it in the chat if you know it. Extra points if you know who any of the other athletes are. But
Andre
that's,
Agassi is our popular response.
yeah, Andre Agassi. And if you're a tennis fan, you might know David Wheaton, Jim Courier, Nick Bollettieri in the middle, and Martin Blackman, who was a very prominent junior when Agassi was coming up. Now, was it a good choice on behalf of Agassi? Well, just like Becker, within literally 18 months, Agassi was knocking on the door of a top 10 ranking by 1988. And in 1988 and 1989, Agassi would face Becker for the first 3 times. And he would face what he called from Becker, the likes of which the game had never seen before. And each time, Becker cleaned Agassi's clock. Straight sets, wasn't even close. In fact, the last one of those 3 defeats came at the hands of, in Madison Square Garden, at the year-ending Masters event, and Becker defeated Agassi 6-3, 6-1, wiped him off the court. Now, a frustrated Agassi needed to figure Boris out. Specifically, he started to watch tape of Boris playing. And Boris had this signature kind of rocking motion right before he tossed the ball to serve. And what Agassi noticed by looking at Boris with a new set of eyes is that Boris did something really interesting with his tongue. And so when Boris was serving the ball right down the middle, or what we call the T in tennis, his tongue would be right in the middle of his mouth. If he was serving the ball out wide, his tongue would go to the side of his mouth. Now, based on that observation, just 4 months later, in 1990, Agassi would face Becker in the semifinals. In the semifinals of Indian Wells, which is the 5th biggest event. And using that knowledge, he would defeat Boris 6-4, 6-1. And then over the course of the next 9 years, Agassi and Becker would face each other another 10 times. Agassi would win 9 of the next 10 matches. And I'm going to play this video. It's and I think it's telling. Agassi is talking about the game of tennis and what tennis is about, specifically about seeing the eyes.
Tennis is about problem solving. It's really what it is. And you can't problem solve unless you have the ability or the empathy to perceive all that's around you. The more you understand what the problem is through other people's lens, the more you can solve for people in life and in business.
Okay, so that really sets up this idea of being able to see a little bit differently. also to understand a little bit about yourself. And it's the central thesis of the book, The Diamond Goldfish. And so let me break down for you why diamond and why a goldfish, and we'll start with why diamond first. So diamond is based on this idea of practicing business according to what we call the diamond rule. And we believe it's the 4.0 version of thriving in business. So if it's the 4.0, then there has to be a 1.0, 2.0, and a 3.0 that precede it. And so let's go all the way back to the 1.0. The 1.0 is called the silver rule. And the silver rule dates all the way back to the days of Confucius. In fact, in the book Intellect, they talk about the idea of what you wish your neighbor not to do unto you, you should also not do onto your neighbor. So breaking down the silver rule, it's pretty simple. It's what? Do no harm. Now, that's not a bad place to start, right? Just don't do bad stuff. In fact, what do you think? Well, that's all the way back in the time of Confucius. Well, when Google was founded in the 1990s, what was Google's core tenet that they just changed just 3 years ago? It was this: don't be evil. So it's not a bad place to start as a 1.0. In fact, if you think about it, it really creates just a good foundation. But the problem is it doesn't necessarily tell you what to do. It's not prescriptive. It just merely tells you what not to do. So following the 1.0 is, I guarantee, a rule that everyone on this webinar right now knows like the back of their hand. The 2.0 is the golden rule. In fact, Marriott Hotels is running an entire campaign about the golden rule right now. Golden rule: simply do unto others as you would have them do unto you. So not only don't do the bad stuff, but also the good stuff as well. How you want to be treated by others is how you treat other people. Now, this seems like a great rule. In fact, when you're raising children, I think it's great advice. And you can find the golden rule in literally every culture and religion. But when it comes to sales and client management, the golden rule is horrible, because it makes a central assumption, and that assumption is this: that how you would want to be treated is exactly how the person that you're dealing with wants to be treated themselves. And here's the thing: there's 4 predominant behavioral styles. So unless you and I are the same style, for 3 out of 4 people, I'm not going to resonate in terms of how I treat that other person, if I'm basing it upon how I want to be treated. But again, it's better than the silver rule. So it kind of sits on top of that don't do no harm. And now it's a little bit more positive as well as negative, right? But here's the thing: it's all about yourself and how you want to get treated. So it's very much inward. The 3.0 version that improves upon the golden rule is simply this: it's the platinum rule. And the platinum rule is a little bit more grounded in emotional intelligence. It says, look, if I treat Margaret the way that Stan would like to get treated, that's not always going to fit with Margaret. But being a little more emotional intelligent, if I can figure out the way that Margaret wants to get treated, and I treat Margaret that way, that's going to resonate. So it's simply this: treating others the way they would like to get treated. And so this is, again, an improvement from the golden rule in the fact that it's more outward, where you're focusing on the other person, figuring out what their needs are, and then delivering those things. But the platinum rule makes a big assumption. If you're so focused on the other person, who are you potentially neglecting? Well, if your focus is entirely on the other person, you're starting to neglect yourself and how you're feeling as part of that back and forth. And the problem with that is it may be a great plan to focus on the other person, but in the words of Mike Tyson, everyone has a plan right up until they get punched in the mouth, right? So you can be focusing on the other person, but if something happens to trigger you and you start to get out of sorts, you're not going to be as effective because you're going to get thrown off your game. Now, the diamond rule actually applies the best parts of the golden rule and the platinum rule and puts it together. And the diamond rule is simply this. It's the ability first to manage yourself under pressure, which then allows you to address the needs of others and help them to avoid their triggers so they act rationally, right? Simply this, why diamond? How are diamonds created? You know, diamond is simply a piece of coal that did well under pressure. Now, again, this is the 4.0 version. It sits kind of in between the golden rule and the platinum rule, right? First, it challenges you to do this, what we call neutralize. So first you have to control yourself and understand the things that trigger you and put you off balance. And once you get yourself under control, it allows you to then focus on the other person and their style to be address the needs that they have. So the first is neutralize, then you're empathizing and working with that other person. So the diamond is simply this, it's about how you handle pressure and yourself. Now, really quickly, and we'll use the chat for this, Margaret, because I'm going to break down why a goldfish. So why a goldfish in this diamond goldfish? The goldfish is a metaphor for growth and differentiation. And it has to do with me when I was growing up. So if you can remember your first pet that was totally your own, for me, it was when I was 6 years old. I'll never forget it. I went to a carnival. I threw the ping pong ball and I walked home with my very first pet. His name was Oscar. And come to find out that the average goldfish, some grow smaller, some grow bigger, but on average, they only grow to be 3 inches, which is the size of an average person's thumb. So there you go. You get a little bit of a measuring device right here, 3 inches. But if you had to guess, and throw it out in the chat, let's see if somebody gets it. If you had to guess what the world's largest goldfish is, how long in inches? Now, not a carp, not a koi, just an average, ordinary goldfish, how big? We have any guesses, Margaret?
Not yet, but I'm watching for them to come in. Oh, we have a really wide range between
Okay.
a low of 3 inches all the way up to a high of 24 inches.
Ooh, okay, we're going to do wisdom of the crowd. Well, 24, 3, you might have some in between. You're looking right now at the world's largest goldfish. It comes from Holland. Everything is bigger in the Netherlands, but it's nearly 20 inches. Just think about that for a second. Like how is that even possible? That would be like you walking out of your house or your apartment this morning, right? And bumping into somebody who's what? Like 3 stories tall. Like, how is that even possible? Well, here's the thing. It turns out for a goldfish, and here's the thing, every business and every person in their career on this webinar right now, your growth is impacted by 5 things. So I'm going to break down the goldfish growth factor, but I want you, as we talk about each of these 5, to think about how does it apply in business. So the first one most people have heard about for a goldfish, and it happens to be the size of the bowl or the pond that they're in. So the bigger the bowl, the bigger the pond, the more the goldfish will typically grow. So it's a direct correlation. What's the size of the bowl or the pond, though, if you're in business? What's the size of the bowl or the pond? And I'll tell you, it's simply this. It's the market for your product or service. And that makes sense, right? The bigger the market that you serve, the more you can grow. The smaller the market, the harder it's going to be to grow. Now, the second thing for goldfish, their growth is also impacted by who? Their growth is also impacted by the other goldfish in the bowl or the pond, right? And this one's now an inverse correlation. So the more goldfish that are in the bowl or the pond, the harder it's going to be for that goldfish to grow. The less, the easier it's going to be for them to grow. So who are the other goldfish in business? You're struggling with this one, you're in trouble, because it's simply this: your competition. Now, this third one is going to be harder, but it's so applicable to where we're at right now. If you're a goldfish, your growth is going to be impacted by what? The quality of the water in that bowl or pond. So the nutrients that are in the bowl or the pond, the cloudiness of the water is going to impact your growth. So the more nutrients, the less cloudiness, the more you will grow. So what is that surrounding environment in business? And I want you to think kind of macro, right? What's the quality of the water? It's simply this: it's the economy, right? Your ability, potentially the nutrients could be the ability to get capital. That cloudiness could be things like consumer confidence, people's willingness to travel and spend. Here's number 4. So for a goldfish, how do they do their first 120 days of life, first 4 months? So they are tiny when they're born. In fact, you call a baby goldfish a fry, as in small fry. They're the size of a top of a pin. They have 100 brothers and sisters. What's the equivalent if you're in business of your first 120 days? It's simply this: if you're how you do as a startup, or if you launch a new product or service, how that does in that critical, first 4 months of life. So what have we had so far? We've had the size of the bowl was the market. The other goldfish were competition. The quality of the water in that surrounding was the economy. And now we have the first 4 months, which is when you're a startup or you launch a new product or service. Number 5 is this: genetic makeup. So for a goldfish, what are they born with that separates them from all of the other goldfish in the pond? And the stronger their genes are, and the more that they are separated, typically, the bigger they grow. If their genes are weak and they're like everyone else, the less they typically grow. So what's genetic makeup in business? It's simply this: it's how you are differentiated from other companies or other people. And the stronger your differentiation, typically the better and the more you will grow. Now, here's the thing: I'm going to assume most of the people on this webinar have been in a company that's been around for more than 4 months? So for most of you, we're going to throw that out. Of the remaining 4, market, competition, economy, and differentiation, what's the only thing that you have control over? Does anyone here have control over the market? Probably not. Does anyone have control over the competition? Not unless you're buying them. And if anyone on this webinar has control over the economy, please see me after the webinar. That would be great, right? The only thing we have control over is how we differentiate what we do, and more importantly, how we do it. And when it comes to the diamond goldfish, that differentiation piece is how we manage the relationships that we have. How do we manage relationships with prospects? How do we manage the existing clients and customers that we have? And even how do we manage the relationships within our own company to be most efficient? Now, here's the thing. If I could show you that if you made small changes on how you manage those prospects and clients, that it would make a big difference, would you want to lean in and do more? So let me share some research. The first one here is from Gartner. Gartner said if you could improve your retention rate by 5 percentage points, meaning that the average business, right, they lose 25% of their customers each year. If you could get that number down to just 20%, the impact to the bottom line is between 25% bottom line profitability, between 25% all the way up to 125%. Now, why is that? Well, I think very simply, it costs a lot to replace customers, so you're saving that money. The longer your customers stay with you, the more profitable they become. And lastly, if a higher number are sticking around, it means they're probably having a better experience. And what do people do when they have a better experience? They refer, making it easier to get the new customers that you need. Now, how about on the sales side of the equation? What if you could go from the 19% close rate and jump that up to 24%? Well, simply that would represent an increase of 27% to your top line sales by just making that 5 percentage point difference to go from 19 to 24%. Now, if we're going to excel in terms of managing the relationships and especially managing pressure, it makes sense that we have to understand how our brain works under pressure. And essentially, the brain is essentially divided into 3 main parts. And I'm going to tell you a little bit of how each of the parts work, and particularly how it works when we feel like we're under pressure. The first part is at the base of our brain. It's the oldest part of our brain. It's called the amygdala. Now, the amygdala is sometimes referred to as the reptilian brain because it's the only part of the brain a reptile has, and essentially it only has one function. And that one function is to kind of be a human highlighter. Meaning like it's always constantly looking at the surroundings and going, is there potentially a threat here? And here's the thing, it sits, if I put it right here, it sits right here at the base of the brain. It's the size of an almond, right? but it's constantly just looking for threats. It's constantly scanning. Now, the area that surrounds the amygdala is what's called the limbic system. And the role of the limbic system is that's where long-term memory is stored within our brain, but it's also the part of our brain that controls all of our bodily functions. So it tells our heart to beat. When we're sleeping at night, it's telling our body to breathe. It's also the thing that controls our sweat glands. In a very important function. Now, the third and the biggest part of our brain is what's called the neocortex. And the neocortex, new cortex, this is the most recent thing that's developed for us as humans. It's the thing that truly makes us human as human beings. This is where art, higher level reasoning resides. This is where a lot of rational thought and our decision making comes from, until one thing happens. And that one thing is when the amygdala senses a threat, it then sends chemical signals to our limbic system alerting to the threat, and then the limbic system kicks into gear. Specifically, it shuts down a lot of the thinking part of our brain, and we go into kind of threat mode. So if I had to give you an example of this, the amygdala in action, right, it would be public speaking. So, Mark Twain says that there's only two types of public speakers in the world, the nervous and the liars. There's not anyone that's watching this webinar right now that when they get up to speak, they don't sense that physiological response to a potential threat. In fact, what's interesting, and according to most studies, the fear of speaking is actually greater than what? The fear of dying. So Jerry Seinfeld has a great bit about this. He says, think about that. Does that make any sense whatsoever? He said, that means if you go to a funeral, that more people would rather be in the coffin, right, than giving the eulogy. And the reason why, it's because the amygdala is sensing a threat. Now, the challenge is it's not a threat to our life. It's a threat to our identity and what other people might think of us as we get up and speak. And the problem is that over the course of time, our biology cannot tell the difference between a real or a perceived threat. And when the amygdala kicks in and it gets the limbic system going, think about the last time you had to speak. Your breathing gets labored, your heart starts to beat a little faster, you start to sweat a bit. That's your biology kicking in because you've been triggered by a potential threat. Now, we have to understand that we all face these triggers and feel pressure. But what's important, we all pretty much react in 4 predictable ways. And I'm going to share 4 animals with you that represent each of these 4 responses. And the first one is what we call the rhino. Now, when a rhino feels like they're under pressure, what do? Their response is to do what? To charge right in and start to dictate, right? They're going to run right towards the threat and try to address it. Now, the second quadrant is what we call the deer quadrant. Now, what happens with a deer when a deer feels that heightened sense of threat? And we've all seen this before, man. They take off like a shot. Their survival strategy is to do what? We call it migrate. They're going to try to go somewhere else. Birds fall into this category. Go somewhere else where the environment is more suited to their liking. The third type is what we call the porcupine. So porcupine doesn't have the legs of a deer. It's not going to charge right at it. What does a porcupine do when it's under pressure? It simply hunkers down, puts its quills up, and their plan is to kind of tolerate or stick around until the danger is gone, and then they can get up again and resume what they're doing. The fourth and final type is what we call the bear quadrant. And for a bear, what they do is when they feel like the food supply is under threat, the weather is changing, what's their strategy? They simply go and they shut down, their body can lower their bodily functions, and they hibernate. So same things with rodents and snakes are part of this strategy. Now here's the thing, they're four pretty defined strategies, but we're human beings and we do each of these four things, but we don't have, like a rhino does, this massive horn, right? So do me a favor, we've just launched a poll. As you think about a rhino, a deer, a porcupine, or a bear, which one do you normally, what's your strategy? Which one are you more like when you feel like you're under pressure?
So we do have our audience weighing in. I'll tell you that myself, I guess the way you described it, I would have to say I fell under porcupine, but and porcupine is ahead at the moment, but it's pretty close. Although very few bears. We're going to give
Okay,
just another second or so, and then I'm going to close the poll and show the results. Okay.
great.
All right.
So what do we have on the total results? Okay, gotcha. 30. Oh, interesting. And just a few bears. Interesting.
Yeah. There we go.
Excellent. So here's the thing. These survival strategies dictate the four predominant behavioral styles. And so the first part of, there's an assessment in the book. What we do is we want to take the assessment. It just takes 10 minutes, but it allows you to figure out if you fall into one of these four categories: a control, an influence, a power, or an authority. So I'm going to share this right now, and I believe, Margaret, we're going to share this with everyone as well after, for them to be able to go and take the assessment if you want.
We will share it,
Because
absolutely. And we put it
so
out
the
on
table
social
stakes
media
is
for a
really
few
trying to
people too.
understand first yourself, and which one of these four behavioral styles that you fit into. So I'm going to quickly describe each of the four. What I want you to do, if you have a pen or pencil, I'm going to ask you to write down somebody's name who kind of represents each of these four styles. And one of those names might be you as we describe it. But we'll start with, at the top, the C is what we call the control. Now, a control is predominantly focused on the future. They look out 3 to 5 years. They always want to make sure that there's a plan and what's going to happen next. And in the absence of a plan, they're all about thinking and planning. In the absence of a plan, they're going to charge in and start to take over. And they don't, sometimes they'll ruffle feathers. They have no problem telling other people what to do. So who do you know that you think might be a control? I'll give you a second to write that down. The second type is what we call influence. So influencers are, they live in the now. They're all about coming up with ideas. They're usually great in a room. They're talkative. And once they make a decision, they're like, go, go, go. Let's move forward. Again, they're idea magnets and generators. Who do you know that might fall into this category of what's called an influence? By the way, I'm an off the chart influence. Let's have you write that down. The third type is what we call a power. So powers are diligent, they're dependable, they tend to be like the workhorses on a team. Their timeline is always looking at about 90 days. They love having to-do lists. They love getting stuff done. They're the first one to raise their hand to take on additional work. And they're all about trying to not rock the boat, but continue to get stuff done and get stuff cranked out. Who do you know that might be a power? The fourth and the last style is an authority. So authorities, they're all about trying to get as much information as they can. Their timeline is actually to look backwards. They're all about trying to make sure that we're optimizing what we're doing right now, before we go and start to do something else. They have a high, preference for quality. And they don't want to make a decision unless they feel like they have all of the information and they're an authority on the matter. So who do you know that you work with, or family or colleague, that's an authority? So real quickly, we're going to review the 4 behavioral styles, and then I'm going to share a little bit of the mind framework, and then we're about 5 minutes away from questions. So if you have any questions, feel free to put those in the box. But let's review each of the 4 styles. The first one was that rhino. When they're under threat, their biology says to what? Dictate and charge into it. Their concern is certainty. They want to know what? They want to know that there is a plan in place, and their behavioral style, in the absence of a plan, they're going to try to control the situation. The second type was the deer or the bird. Remember, they're under pressure, they're going to flee. Their strategy is to migrate, right? They want to know that there's freedom, right? They want to know that they have the ability to have options and flexibility because they live in the now. They want to be able to influence their surroundings, right? The third type, their strategy is to what? This is the porcupine, to tolerate, kind of hunker down. What do they want to know? They want to know that there's stability, right? That there's a process. They want to know that there's a structure, and they're happiest when they're what? They're powering through and getting things done. That last one, the bear quadrant, was to what? Hibernate. Their concern is that security, let's not do anything that's irresponsible, right? They want to know how things are ultimately going to work out. And unless they have all of the information and feel like they're an authority, they're not going to want to move forward. So really quick, how do you put this into place? You use what we call the mind framework when you're dealing in these relationships. And MIND is an acronym for this. First off is mindset. And the mindset is about focusing on the relationship and not just on, the transactional. And the ability to walk into that room or that interaction with that prospect or client with a very open mind, to be able to find out more about them and value that relationship. The I in the mind is to identify, meaning that you very quickly want to be able to judge which of the 4 behavioral styles that they're a fit for. So there are ways that you can do that by judging your surroundings, to be able to ask some open-ended questions that elevate a little bit of pressure to see how they respond. But once you've figured out what their style is, now you're ready to do the N and the E. And the N, and we talked about this before with the diamond rule, is to neutralize, meaning that we want to figure out how we can control ourselves, right, to make sure that we're not getting triggered. So we want to be able to walk into that meeting or that interaction with a clear head, knowing the things that get us triggered based upon our style, so we can kind of manage ourselves. And once we've managed ourselves, then we do what? We empathize. We start working with the other person. We start to view them not just as a problem, but view the things that they have as a concern, because you can always address concerns. You don't want things to rise to the level of problems. And you want to be focused on delivering on the relationship. How can you help them elevate their identity and grow that relationship? Now we've got a tool that's in the handouts right now. It's what we call the Diamond Rule Matrix. And simply after you've taken the assessment and you know your own individual style, so for example, I'm an influence, so I would simply go down this column and I will be able to see how I can interact, and it gives me guidance for interacting and connecting with the other styles. So again, first, take the assessment so you know who you are, and that's a free assessment. And then second, use this as a handy tool as a reference when you're going into a new relationship or dealing with a potential concern or issue with a client, to give you guidance on how to best handle it. And with that, we've got about 10 minutes left. I would love to open it up, Margaret, for, I call it questions and comments.
Perfect, because we do have a few of those. One is, I think, a frequently asked question about this style assessment of this type or any other is, can you fall into more than one category?
Yeah, so here's the thing. On a day-to-day basis, we can jump out of each of these 4 different styles, right? We can be the control that's thinking and planning for down the road. We can be that influence that's popping up with ideas. We can put our head down and be that power that's getting stuff done and cranking stuff out. And we can even be the authority that's really, doing that after action review and trying to figure out how to optimize and improve. But here's the thing, all of us, pretty much by the time we're about 8 or 9 years old, have pretty much imprinted our one survival strategy. And so under pressure, we tend to fall back onto that. And here's the thing, when things are going well, and we all know this, when things are going well, it's not an issue. You're not getting triggered, right? So I think, yeah, you can act as each of the 4 styles, but know that there's always one that you fall back on. And it's important to know when you feel that pressure and that trigger welling up.
All right, a couple more good questions. One here is asking if mine is comparable to Myers-Briggs or DISC or any of the ones that have been out there.
So the overarching assessment, it was developed about 30 plus years ago. My partners on this, Tony Cooper and Travis Carson, this is what they do on a day-to-day basis. It's called market force. and it's the Market Force Styles Indicator. There are some similarities with whether it's DISC or Myers-Briggs, or maybe even Strengths Finders. I think those assessments, for the most part, tend to be more focused on personality, and they're focused on you the entire time. So they work well from like a silver and a golden rule perspective, but they're not all that helpful when it comes to managing the relationships with others. So similarities, but a lot of, I think, different in some crucial ways.
Yeah, I agree. I remember hearing that the ones that are observable qualities help you to have relationships rather than just know about your own style.
Right.
Um,
Yeah, we talk about, Margaret, we talk about this idea. This is something you have to work at. It's not easy, but it's the idea of upgrading what we call your humanware, your ability to be in that room and to sense what the different styles of the people are. And here's the thing, if you're going to be successful in business, it's helping other people to get what they need, right? And there's a great quote, if you can help other people get what they need, you're going to have no problem in life and business.
That's so true. So our next question asks about our kind of new normal, next normal of so many things being virtual, and our question is about, with meetings having gone, to phone calls and online and things like that, is that conducive to this method?
I think it's conducive. I think it actually raises the stakes a little bit more, because as we're doing stuff in a virtual basis, we don't kind of get that, the feeling that you get when you walk into somebody's office or into the conference room to get a sense of everyone and the vibe that's going on. So I think the cues are a little bit more difficult in a virtual setting. But I think the ability to be able to manage yourself, which then allows you to focus on others, is probably more important in a virtual type of setup. And I think as we go forward with this kind of new normal, I think we're going to have to get used to reading the proverbial room is more going to be about reading the screen, if that makes sense.
And that's what these kind of two questions that just came in were, kind of focusing on, gaining rapport quickly, or could you provide open-ended questions that kind of would get some of the answers that, that people need?
Yeah, and in the book we talk about, there's about 10 different ways that you can start to understand very quickly by going, all right, based upon how they're leading, you can start to rule out some of the styles. And so there are different ways that you can kind of weed through and get better at picking up the styles of others. A lot of that, though, is sometimes just through observation. So that, again, that just on a flat screen where you're maybe not seeing their dress, you're going to be limited in the information that you have.
Yes, yeah, that does change things for everyone. So that's great. I'm going to go with one more question, and I think it'll be our final one for today. How do we overcome this biology to react better when we're under pressure? We've talked about how to recognize it, how to assess what other people's styles are, but what do we do?
What do we do? Well, there's good news and there's bad news. You want the bad news first?
Oh, always.
We cannot change our biology. We're talking about millions of years of hardwiring, and the best we can do is try to help manage our biology. So the best thing I would tell you is that once you start to feel that you're getting triggered, the best thing that you can do is not react straight away. So if you can kind of step back and kind of calm yourself a little bit or step out of the room for a second, you don't want to react. One of my favorite quotes in the entire book, which I think is a great lesson, comes from Viktor Frankl. Viktor Frankl was a Holocaust survivor, an Austrian neuroscientist, and he said something really telling. He said between stimulus and response, he said there is space. And he said in that space, we're given our ability and our power to choose how we respond. And in that choice lies our growth and our freedom. So to me, the takeaway is that we can't control that stimulus sometimes, but we can control how we respond. And if we can figure out that we're not giving into that trigger and responding through pressure, if we can step back, it's going to be better for all of our relationships. So I'm going to finish with I'm going to finish back with that Andre Agassi quote that I shared on that video, but I'm going to switch it up. If you remember, he said tennis. He talked about just tennis in general. So here's the thing, just to wrap it up. Excellence under pressure is the ability or the empathy to perceive all that's around you. The more you can understand what the concerns are, right? If you can understand based upon other people's styles, you can understand what they need, right? The more you can thrive under pressure and solve for people in life and in business. So with that, I'll throw it back to you. Thank you guys for taking the time over this hour. I hope you take the assessment. That's the first step in learning more about yourself. And I wish you all the best going forward.
Stan, gosh, thank you so much. That was an awesome presentation. And thank you for providing that assessment for free. For the people who asked about that, we'll make sure we get that sent out to you so that you can take advantage of the code that makes it free for you. We had a great enthusiastic audience today, so thank you all for being with us and for enhancing the discussion and responding to all of the questions and polls and everything. We've really enjoyed seeing your input. So I wanted to provide a friendly reminder that our virtual Lunch and Learn series takes place on Wednesdays at noon Eastern Time. We hope it's easy for you to remember because it's the middle of the week and the middle of the day. For more information, you can always visit our webpage, business.rutgers.edu/alumni/lifelong-learning. And thanks to the great suggestions from our previous audiences, we have an exciting schedule of topics and presenters lined up over the next several months. We encourage you to keep sharing your thoughts with us so the series can continue to meet your evolving needs. So please stay online for just a moment longer as today's webinar ends, because you'll see a very brief 3-question survey about today's event. And one of those questions is a free-form field to type in topics or speakers you'd like to see featured in the future. And finally, as I mentioned when our webinar began earlier, a link to the archived recording of this presentation will be shared via social media and emailed to you. It will also be on the Business Insights page of our website. So thanks so much, everyone. Enjoy the rest of your day.